Mob Daughter by Karen Gravano Chapter 4. How do you say ricotta? One day we went to Staten Island to look at houses. I was only 7. One minute we went there to look at real estate, and the next thing I knew, we were saying goodbye to Bensonhurst and heading west across the Verrazano Narrows to the rural farmlands, deep in the boonies of Staten Island. I was very happy we were moving to the burbs. I had only one good friend in Brooklyn, so I was too young to feel overly attached to my old neighborhood. To me, the move meant that we had made it. We were in the money. Our new house was even going to have plush wall-to-wall carpet, so I knew my mother would be a pig in mud with her vacuum. We were leaving behind my Aunt Diane, my mother's twin sister, and her new husband, Sandy, who was different from my father. Not a street guy at all. But they knew where to find us if they wanted, and they did. They moved into the house attached to ours on Leggett Place. Their daughter, my cousin Gina, was just a baby at the time. My other cousin, Anthony, hadn't been born yet. Everything about the move was exciting. My father bought all new furniture, so there were always trucks and moving men bringing in things like an enormous new living room set still wrapped in plastic, or burros and beds for the bedrooms. My bedroom was yellow and white, and I had a canopy bed outfitted with all new bedding in the style of a princess. My father built brick flower planters inside the house, trying to make the place fancy and special. This first house on Staten Island was on Leggett Place, about 3 miles west of the Verrazano Bridge. The development was made up of new homes or homes that hadn't even been built yet. It was surrounded by farmland, but the best part was that there were a lot of younger families just starting out with kids around Gerard's and my age. Everything was done very communally. Gerard and I would watch out the window to see who was outside, and then we'd join the tons of other kids playing games and riding their bikes in the streets. All the mothers would hang out talking about current events, child issues, or meals, the favorite topics. If someone went in to cook dinner, the other moms on the street would watch out for anyone left. At night after dinner, we'd all go into one another's basements and hang out until it was time for bed. Most of the people in the neighborhood were Italian. In fact, a lot of them moved from Brooklyn to Staten Island just like us. About a year after our arrival, I was so excited when my Aunt Fran and Uncle Eddie and my cousins Lillian, Bud, Jerry, and Rena moved in directly across the street. Dad told us that he wanted his sister to move there so she would be closer to us. Even my grandparents were moving in with them, to a small attached apartment on the ground floor. I didn't know it then, but Uncle Eddie had lost his construction business. My father's parents had sold their house, which was their retirement home, to help bail him out. It killed my father that they had to sell their house and move to help Eddie. Fran was family, and my dad was going to do whatever he had to do to take care of his sister. He made a $30,000 score and helped them move, get furniture, and get them out of their financial jam. My dad had to stop doing our own construction project, and for a while our new furniture purchases were over. Luckily, the new beds had been some of the first things to arrive. I liked that Eddie, Fran, and the rest of the Garafalos were across the street. We visited back and forth all the time. We had our people on the block now and had great times together. Initially, my father had been sad that his parents had to move just because of Eddie's situation, but it all worked out in the end. My grandparents seemed happy there, and after all, my father was my grandmother's baby, so being close to him was a bonus for her. When my grandfather died 8 months later, my father was even more relieved that my grandmother had moved so much closer to us rather than being stuck in the old house. My brother Gerard loved food, so having relatives nearby who loved to feed him was perfection. He'd go over and eat a meal at Grandma's house, then he'd go to Aunt Fran's and eat there, and then he'd come home and eat at our house. But he'd tell everyone he hadn't eaten yet, so he'd get 3 meals out of the deal. Sometimes from a farm behind the development, Gerard would steal a big squash or a tomato from my grandmother to put in her sauce. One time the farmer was chasing Gerard down the block, telling him to bring back the stolen vegetables. Grandma was out there too, screaming back at the farmer, "Don't you touch my grandson. "He was stealing my vegetables," the guy yelled back. But my grandmother prevailed, and both the squash and the tomato ended up in her sauce. It was delicious. We all loved Grandma Kay. Having her across the street made it so easy to see her. She made the best sauce in the whole world. I was 13 when she died. She hadn't been herself since my grandfather had passed away. She was really sad and she started to get sick. She was the one who had originated my nickname KG, and for my 13th birthday, she gave me a necklace with my initials in diamonds. Everybody got their initials in diamonds when they turned 16, so it was odd that I was getting mine at 13. She also bought me all of my china and silverware engraved with my initials for when I got married. She must have thought she wasn't going to make it in 3 more years. The night before she died, we all went to the hospital to say goodbye. In the morning, she had passed away from a heart attack. Dad was sad, but he didn't harp on it. Tony Ann was my best friend on Leggett Place. She lived 2 houses away. She was 2 years older than me, but that didn't bother either of us. We were in the same general age group, and we went to the same public school. Her parents both worked. Her father was a regular working guy, a 9 to 5er, and her mother was a hairdresser. We used to sleep over at each other's houses all the time. We lost touch in our teenage years. I became a bad kid, sneaking out and going to nightclubs when I was 14. She didn't do stuff like that, so she hung out with the good kids, while I regrouped with the ones who liked trouble. I remember the one time Tony Ann made me so upset I almost cried. All Italians are very serious about their food, and we Gravanos were no exception. Tony Ann asked me to say the word ricotta, so I complied and said the word exactly as she had said it, ricotta. She responded with a hurtful taunt. "So there, you're not Italian. Italians say ricotta." I was in disbelief. I knew I was Italian, and I couldn't even understand why she was challenging me. I pleaded my case. "You said to say ricotta, so I said ricotta. If you had said, 'How do you say ricotta?' I would have said ricotta." I may not have known my father was in the mafia, but I knew I was as Italian as Cristobal Colon, even if I hadn't come over on the Santa Maria 500 years earlier. On Sundays, the whole family would go to Brooklyn to my mother's parents' house on 15th Avenue and 86th Street for church and dinner. Dad didn't go to church, but the rest of us will walk to St. Francis Cabrini on 86th Street. After the service, Grandpa and I would walk to the Italian bakery and we'd get fresh bread and fresh mozzarella. Grandma would make us a huge Italian dinner of pasta and chicken and everything else. While she was cooking, Dad and I would go for our Sunday ritual of getting the car washed. He'd hand all the guys working there a nice tip if they'd polished it to look brand new. Other days, he'd take me with him to the construction office or even the social club once in a while. We were a team to be reckoned with, and I loved having him to myself. My father was the only one in our neighborhood. Bull's Head, who was in the mob when we arrived on Staten Island. Our neighbors on Leggett Place all knew Dad was a gangster, but they didn't care. He had such people skills and was so normal and unpretentious that everybody liked him. He made everybody feel comfortable, just the opposite of a reaction you'd think they'd have. They knew his reputation as a tough guy, but that didn't affect how he was a neighbor. He'd help everybody in any way he could. He wasn't exactly the handiest person outside of specialty carpentry, so if someone needed help with his car or mower, he'd tinker around a bit before calling someone else to help. He'd usually know the best person to call. It was on Staten Island that my dad got back into the construction business. When Eddie went broke, he begged my father to bring him into the life. My father understood that there was big money in construction, and he knew how to use his mob muscle to get the jobs, and he used his good work ethic to keep them coming. Uncle Eddie was the technical person, the nuts and the bolts guy, who knew exactly how to get the construction done. He was good at making sure the crews were working and that they all had their necessary materials. Dad was good at being a gangster. I will admit, they made a good team. Dad got the jobs and Uncle Eddie executed them. Now that my father was back in the construction business, he and Paul Castellano had a lot more in common. Paul had been in control of the building industry in New York for the mob for quite some time. In fact, Paul, the capo, the boss of all bosses, had a stranglehold on anything concrete. Excuse me. If a project in New York City involved the pouring of cement, the man had a hand in it. My father was doing jobs for Paul, So now he was at the mansion on Todd Hill a lot. Dad and Eddie's new business specialized in plumbing, and Paul was one of their first clients. Paul's house was so big that the water pressure fell off dramatically on the upper floors, so showering up there was very unpleasant. My father suggested installing a secondary station with an extra pump, and Paul was really happy with the result. Paul's affection for my father was sealed, and it wasn't long before he was throwing him and Eddie lots of work. One time my father brought me and my brother along with him to the mansion. The two men, my father and Paul, were going to talk business, and we were along for the ride. Paul's wife Nina answered the massive front door. She wasn't at all what I expected. I thought she'd be really dressed up formal and fancy. Instead, she was unadorned and more like a grandmother, warm and welcoming. She stood barely 5 feet. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and she wore a simple dress tailored below the knee. She brought Gerard and me into a kitchen bigger than our house. Dozens of shiny copper pots hung over a center island stove set in a pink marble countertop. A big ceiling fan circulated the aroma of freshly baked cookies, which she pulled from the oven. Gerard and I sat at the island eating cookies and drinking milk while our dad was otherwise disposed. We had never been inside a house like this, but living on Todd Hill was in our future. We were still at Leggett Place when Dad decided he needed to unload the Plaza Suite, his most successful business in Gravesend. Even though he loved running it, he had become so busy with the construction business, it was almost like he had two jobs. During the day, he worked at the construction office on the ground floor below. At night, the construction crews needed him for jobs, or so I thought. He couldn't be at the nightclub and out with the crew at the same time. He had two of his best guys, Mike DeBet and Tommy Huck Carbonaro, overseeing the operation, hoping that would let him keep it. However, when the check guy, Frank Fiala, made him the offer of $1 million for the nightclub and building, Dad couldn't say no. It was 5 times the market value. It wasn't until many years later that I finally learned the truth about what had happened between my father and Frank Fiala. Frank had put a hole through the wall of the construction office to connect it to when he hadn't even anteed up yet. My father was pissed when he went to Brooklyn to confront him. When Dad got there, Fiala was sitting at my father's desk, surrounded by a pack of Doberman pinchers. My father already didn't like him. Fiala had a reputation as a showboater and a sleazy cocaine dealer. Dad demanded an explanation about the damage to the wall, and the guy pulled out an Uzi and pointed directly at my father's chest. My father gathered a couple of buddies up for retaliation. All this happened around the time my family was getting ready to make the big move to Todd Hill. My father always seemed to have one foot in the door of a nicer house as soon as we settled anywhere. He loved construction and the challenge of upgrading a house. God bless you. Paul Castellano living on the hill didn't hurt. He liked proving himself by being a man with a manner. Even though everyone loved living on Leggett Place, my mother had been dabbling in real estate a bit to keep busy, so she had a couple of affordable houses in the well-heeled neighborhood in mind. All right, that was chapter 4. I'll be back with chapter 5, y'all.